Hi everyone. Uh, you've now learned a few lessons about how archaeologists do their work and what we do with the information we retrieve from archaeological investigations, data collection. So you've learned a little bit about how to collect data, what archaeologists do, what archaeology is in principle, and then also how to apply that information to interpretations, to make sense of the past. You've learned a little bit of those methodological and theoretical approaches, and now let's start applying it. And that's what we're going to do for the rest of this course. I might mention some of the things from time to time as we move through the looking at specific examples from the past. Cultures, biological evolution is what we're going to look at today. So I may interleave some of the lessons we learned in the first couple of chapters into what we do in the future. But I'd like to move on from those, assuming that you understand how archaeology is done, at least in principle, and let's start doing it. So let's start at the beginning, shall we? Have humans always been around? Well, no. And we will look at the evolution of our ancestors into us. Humans didn't always exist in this form, and we have ancestors that were non-humans. If you go back far enough, all life on Earth is related to one another, and the processes of evolutionary processes have created what we call species. This is a way, species literally means specific. So what is the specific type of organism that you're talking about? This is a way that scientists have broken down all life into different categories, and there's a sort of a ranked classification scheme that we call a taxonomy. You've probably heard of this before. You've heard of the animal kingdom, the plant kingdom, that sort of thing. We're part of the animal kingdom. And in that sense, we are less related to plants than we are to all the other animals, including squid and jellyfish, as well as bears and dogs, and also monkeys and apes. Do we come from monkeys and apes? No, we don't. Nothing living is very closely related to us. Although a primate, monkeys and apes and other types of animals that are primates, are more closely related to us than a squid or a jellyfish, because the way evolution works is it selects, based on environmental and genetic factors, what type of creatures survive and which don't. And that eliminates some, it concentrates certain features in others, and it separates them. So we're not descended from any monkeys and apes that are out there. That monkey is not your uncle. But we share a common ancestor with all life. It just, how far back do you have to go to find that common ancestor? That's really the question. So primates are more closely related to us than any other creatures on Earth, because we separated from our most closely related living creatures today, which are chimpanzees and bonobos, about 9 million years ago. We know this both through the fossil record and through which is archaeological strata, looking at chronology, and we're going to look at a little bit of that today. And also through genetics, we can see that we have more genetic similarities to chimpanzees and bonobos than we do any other animals that are alive. But they're just as evolved as we are. A chimpanzee and a bonobo, although they're most closely related to us than any other creature, our common ancestor was 9 million years ago. So we've had 9 million years to evolve in one direction, and chimpanzees and bonobos have also had 9 million years to develop in their direction. So what we want to look at is what came between that common ancestor that we shared with a chimpanzee and a bonobo. They went off in that direction, and we went off in this direction. But was it that common ancestor just giving birth to a human? Of course not. That's not the way it works. Certain changes took place because we were adapting to environmental, or our ancestors were adapting to environmental circumstances. Some things work better than others. Wouldn't it be great if you and I had wings or claws or scales or super speed or supervision or all these sorts of things that you see in the animal world, hawks and cheetahs and all sorts of creatures. Wouldn't it be great to have a strength of a bear, right? That'd be terrific. But the way nature works is that everything has a cost. Everything costs something. That you need to pull in nutrition. You need to outcompete nutrition gathering from other animals out there that are trying to take it too. You've got to be there first, you've got to be there best. Otherwise, you won't survive. And even if you do survive, you may not reproduce, which means that your genetic makeup won't get passed on to the next generation. So you've got to be successful not just to survive, but for your genes to survive. So your characteristics, if they're successful, if they work, then you survive long enough to have offspring, and they have your characteristics. But what if you have some sort of a difference from your competitor? Now that difference, my brother doesn't look exactly just like me. I have a slightly different genetic makeup than he does, even though we have the same parents. Am I more competitive than him? Well, that's what nature determines. Am I more successful at surviving and reproducing? That's the question. And if my brother survives and reproduces, his genes will go on to the next generation. And if I'm not successful at surviving and reproducing, my genes won't. So what characteristics I have and how that differs from my brother is really kind of evolution. This is sometimes called survival of the fittest. But it's not really about your survival, it's about the evolutionary survival, the survival from generation to generation. Now, the reason why I'm going over this really basic explanation of evolution is because what we have to ask ourselves is that common ancestor between a chimpanzee and a bonobo and humans, did it look anything like us? Almost certainly not. We don't actually have the exact creature that is that, or we're not sure that we have the exact creature that is that common ancestor, but we have some things around the time period that are suggestive. And it doesn't look particularly human. The animal that we descended from doesn't look particularly human. So what changed, and why did that change? Why do we have two eyes facing forward, color vision? Why are our teeth this way? That's got to be really important to survival, right? If you look at a chimpanzee, a bonobo, a gorilla, they've got great big fangs in the front of their mouths, right? Now, what are those for? You might think fangs, okay, that's for hunting prey, right? Well, as it turns out, primatologists that study chimpanzees and apes in the wild can show that actually that's not for hunting, although some primates can use them for hunting. It's primarily to slice open fruit. That's what it's used for primarily, because a gorilla, for instance, is exclusively vegetarian in their diet, and they eat. They need to grind very coarse vegetal materials, but when they can get them, they love their fruit. It's a really good source of energy for them, and they need to open that up, and they use their big canines in the front of their mouth to do that. So that's the function. That helps them to survive. They have those teeth because that's part of how evolution has allowed them to survive. And because that's important to their survival, it gets passed on to the next generation. So why don't we have them? That's the challenge that archaeologists have to address, is when did those features that we shared with our common ancestors start to change into features that we see in ourselves today? Was it overnight, or was it a gradual progression that took place that slowly started to develop into who we are? And here's a really important question. Why are we so smart? Why do humans have such huge brains that, granted, allow us to take and teach courses on anthropology? That's terrific, but is that really important to our survival? Why do we have such big brains as opposed to most other creatures? I said everything in nature has a cost, right? This has a huge cost. You just sitting there, if you do nothing all day except for sit, 20% of your energy expenditure is your daily energy expenditure is just making your brain function, not the rest of your body. 20% of your daily energy expenditure is on powering your brain. It's like a computer, right? It sucks a huge amount of power. So why would nature naturally select the brain as something that is important to pass on to the next generation? And was it always there? Were we always this smart? When did our intelligence and our ability to do things like make tools come into our evolutionary sequence? When do we see that? Well, good news. We can find this out because archaeology can look into the past and see this long durée, this long time span that allows us to see these changes and find the evidence for them. Now, the further back in time you go, the less evidence there is, unfortunately. As we all know, when things die, they decay, right? That's what normally happens, right? They decay, they decompose, they biodegrade, and you got nothing left. That's the standard. And something that is 9 million years old, or 8 or 7 or 6 or even 1 million years old, it's a really small chance that you're going to find anything from that time period. So what we're going to see in the evidence here is that a lot of the information we have are from little clusters of locations where it's fairly easy to access data and where we know it already exists. So you have a good big discovery, and then you get a bunch of archaeologists, a bunch of paleoanthropologists that cluster to that site because they're like, we know that it's here, but we have no idea if it's someplace else. It's really hard to find. And it doesn't. It doesn't even exist in some places. Even possibly exist. Let me give you an example of this. If you were to have a living creature that was on the big island of Hawaii, just below a volcano, and this creature died, and the lava flowed over it, what do you think is going to happen to the remains of that living creature? It's going to incinerate. It's going to atomize. It's going to melt into the rock. You're not going to have anything left. All you're going to have is rock. That's it. So don't even bother looking for fossil remains of anything in igneous rock that is the product of magmatic or volcanic activities, right? So if it's the place where a volcano was, forget it. Don't even look there. It's not possible. Same thing with metamorphic rock that has intense pressure and heat that's crushing together and forming new types of rock through metamorphosis. Well, that also pulverizes any sort of traces of creatures from the past, so don't bother looking there. There's only one type of rock that you can look at, and that is sedimentary. And even some types of sedimentary rock aren't particularly conducive. Here, let me give you a scenario that a creature is drinking water on the banks of a river, and they keel over, they're dead. That animal falls down into the mud. That evening, the water of the river rises, brings in silt and mud, and covers the banks of the river and buries it in mud. It stops the process of decomposition to some degree, and then the water recedes, but that silt is left behind, and the creature's remains are trapped there in that silt. That silt gets compressed and becomes limestone or sandstone or mudstone or something like that, that is accumulated through sedimentary processes. It's sediment, right? And if that becomes stone, then it could get buried very, very, very deeply. But how does an archaeologist know that it's there? Well, it's impossible. We don't have the money to go around poking deep holes just somewhere that we think fossils might be. But what happens is erosion then subsequently takes place and digs down for us. And that trapped riverbank is now exposed in a ravine. And so it built up, but then it cut back down. And so archaeologists who are looking for very ancient fossils, if you can date that event of that river flood and that limestone that's accumulated there, or mudstone, you can say this is a particular age and time, and anything from it is going to be dating to that time period. And you can actually have fossils eroding out of the side of a gully or a ravine. That means you don't have to dig down, you're actually digging from the side. So these hot spots, especially in East Africa, exist. There's a great big gash that runs up the eastern side of Africa called the Great Rift Valley. And it's a real hot spot for fossils, for human remains especially. And they are some of our best points where we can go and access information about where our ancestors came from. And there's a lot of evidence that tells us that our first ancestors came from Africa. We're going to look at that a little bit. And so let's just go over the learning objectives for this chapter, in fact, in this chapter 3 on early hominins. So let me just go through these. These are the things that the chapter would like you to focus on, which is that the hominin radiation that you should understand the hominin radiation between 4 million and 2 million years ago. Now what that means is the spread of hominins. Our non-chimpanzee and bonobo ancestors. So chimpanzees and bonobos were in those same forests with us, but we were evolving on different lines. We were doing something different. We were a different species, actually a different genus entirely. You should also learn about the major characteristics of lower Paleolithic stone tool industries. That's jumping a little bit forward into some of our more recent ancestors that started to develop things like brains that were capable of understanding how to manipulate their environment and making tool use. And so you should know the evidence for the origin of tool use. And you should also understand the debates about hunting or food sharing by early hominins. Were we hunters? How did we exist in groups? What was going on with that? And then how did there's strong evidence that we started in Africa, when do you start to see humans outside of Africa? When did our ancestors start to spread out from our origin point? And did it happen only once? Is it just we started in Africa and we moved away? Or were there multiple waves of migrations and dispersals and radiation out of Africa? We'll look at those a little bit more in the next chapter, or actually the next two chapters as well. So this is just a little bit of a primer for what we're going to talk about in just a second here. So I'll end this video right now, and we'll come back and we'll start looking at the evidence.